We had spoken about how integral the study of Torah is to one's sense of spirituality, to be able to have a certain degree of appreciation for the laws of the Torah, even if they're statutes. You have like a natural sense of something that has value, although you don't fully understand it. But just as a result of your orientation, you understand, you gravitate towards it. What activates the soul of a Jew? We speak about Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. When you study Torah, that's the all-encompassing energy, spiritual energy. So that spiritualizes the totality of the Jew. It's the password which gets the computer going. And the more you infuse it with that energy, it just keeps soaring. And it becomes even more acute, more sensitive, to be attracted to more of the same. And the more you understand it and grasp it, the less of an issue you have with discerning between good and evil. I'll give you an example. The Chofetz Chaim, who was even the anti-Semitic Poles saw him as a holy man. Was the Chofetz Chaim's issue ever, should he keep dietary laws, not keep dietary laws? Should he observe the Shabbos, should he not observe the Shabbos? That was never part of his equation, never. Should he put on tefillin or not? Should he say the Shema in its proper time or not? Definitely not. Should he study Torah or not study Torah? Never part of the equation. His challenges were that if he could do a mitzvah with a greater level of dedication and selflessness and intent, and he falls slightly short of that because he's at that special level and he's able to meet that challenge, that is his challenge. But to do or not to do, never a question with the Chofetz Chaim. Why? Because he had a level of clarity, of understanding of what's acceptable and what's objectionable. Therefore, there was never a consideration. Does he keep the 613 precepts of the Torah, positive and negative commandments, meticulously? But now we speak about qualitative observance, upgrading continuously. That's his challenge. Even if I upgrade, that I upgraded sufficiently. Was my focus sufficient? Was my feeling sufficient? Those are the challenges of the Chofetz Chaim. But how did he achieve that? As we say, Rome was not built in a day. Life is a process of growth. If you live 100 years, the growth process, you still grow. You could be growing at 100 years. If you live another 500 years and God gives you the mind and the health, you could continue soaring until an additional 500 years. Because the more you're involved in the process and the greater the level of clarity, you see other opportunity which you never even noticed existed. So the first and foremost is, these words which I'm commanding to you at Sinai, and you have to experience them as if they were given today at Sinai. It should be put onto your heart. Take it to heart. Meaning, there should be an ongoing cognizance. If there's an ongoing cognizance, both your positive and negative inclination will be touched by it. No, there's no question. We discussed, the Talmud tells us in a certain tractate, Maseches Tainis, that one of the great rabbis of the Talmud says, Harbi lomadati me rabosai. I learned an enormous amount of knowledge from my teachers. Michaveiro yosi mi rabosai. From my colleagues, I learned more than from my teachers. Umi talmida yosi mi kulam. And from my students, I learned more than from anyone, more than my colleagues, more than my teachers. Now, we ask the question, why? Why is a teacher able to advance himself to a greater degree, and he's able to come upon certain understandings through teaching rather than through intellectual dialogue with your peers, or as a student being mentored by a teacher. For my students, even more than all of them. So the conventional approaches, which is off the cuff, because when you teach and you prepare and you understand that you have to be ready to answer, respond to every question, it's not the level of preparation. And the student asks a question, which maybe you didn't think of the question, so that question brings you another level of understanding. Okay? So I asked the question, if that is the understanding of that, why is this something unique to Torah? It's true regarding any subject, whether you teaching medicine, mathematics, or any science. Due to the teaching process, the interaction between teacher and student, as they say, you get better at your game. You get a greater level of clarity, preparation-wise, interaction-wise, every-wise. But when Rava makes this statement regarding his teachers, his colleagues, and his students, he's speaking specifically about the Torah itself, not about any other subject matter. So the question is why? Why mitalmidi osmi kulam? For my students, even more than my colleagues and my teachers. As we explained yesterday, one's ability to come upon the truths of Torah, you have to meet certain criteria, certain prerequisites. What are they? Humility, we discussed. You have to be able to win yourself from material. And if you don't meet that, and what else? Toil. You have to sacrifice and toil for it. As we quoted the Gemara, Talmud. If you've toiled and you came upon the truth of Torah, you believe that person. If he did not toil, he claims he came upon its truth. You may believe he came upon its truth. He did not. And if you say you toiled and you did not, it's clear you didn't toil sufficiently. Because if you would have toiled sufficiently, would have. So the question is, regarding any other subject matter, science, mathematics, whatever it is, horticulture, if you have a good mind and you're quick-footed, you come upon it without the excessive toil. The Torah has to have that excessive toil. So we answered, because Torah is something of spiritual nature, and it's a gift, and you need special divine assistance to come upon its truths. God is part of that equation. It's not just based on your intellectual endowment that you have a certain kind of mind, but rather you have to be worthy that God should reveal and give you that truth, or that ability, that understanding. For that, you need humility. For that, you need to win yourself material, not to live as a total physical person. And you have to toil. You meet those criteria, then you're qualified to be the repository for Torah and to come upon its truths. This is now, there is an obligation, as the Rambam rules in the laws of Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, that not only does a father have an obligation to teach his son Torah, which is an explicit verse in the Torah, a chocham, a person who has Torah knowledge, and he's able to disseminate that knowledge to others, he has an obligation to disseminate that Torah knowledge to others. The Rambam writes, Kol chocham v'chocham b'Yisrael. Every Torah sage, or person who's knowledgeable of Torah, who's a Jew, chayav l'lami ben chaveiro. You have an obligation to teach the child of your fellow. If you're able to teach, you must share that knowledge that you possess. That's your obligation. Words Rav Rambam, chayav odom lamed es hatalmidim. You must teach the students. So it's not only a father to a child, it's a teacher who has knowledge to Jewish children, to students, children, men, whatever it may be. That's a Torah obligation. What is the basis for Judaism? It all happened back at Sinai, 3,500 years ago. We weren't there. So how do we have the Torah intact 500 years later? The answer is, it's called transmission. Because every generation, the Torah sages of that generation and the Torah scholars, they have an obligation to communicate what was heard at Sinai meticulously, perfectly, to the next generation. And every generation has the responsibility to transmit it to the next generation and to bring it to a level of understanding and clarity to their best ability. That's the obligation of any generation regarding the future generation. And therefore, thousands of years later, we are only knowledgeable of the Torah as it is, as it was given at Sinai, because that was part of the transmission from generation to generation. That each generation, it's Torah scholars, fathers taught their children, accurate transmission. What happens if people will fall short of that responsibility? It's the end of Judaism. Because Judaism is only as it was taught at Sinai. It has to meet that criteria of truth, which is God's word. If it was altered, it's no longer Torah. So what guarantees the authenticity of that transmission? The people who transmit it are qualified transmitters, that they studied it and they have a clarity, and therefore they have the ability to transmit it. And that guarantees the perpetuation, eternity of Torah, which is the purpose of existence. Because God created existence for the observance of the Torah, and only the Jewish people have the capacity to live by the Torah. If a person is a student studying for the teacher, he's only a recipient. He's on the receiving end. When two colleagues interact in a Torah dialogue to come to some level of clarity, what is that? That's a spoke in the wheel of transmission. Because by us entering into a dialogue between us, each of us have give and take. So more than just a recipient of what the teacher's teaching. We give, and there's a critical analysis during this dialogue to come to a level of understanding of what's correct and what's not correct. When a teacher assumes responsibility to teach students, what is he doing? He's assuming a responsibility to guarantee the eternity of Torah. That's what's at stake. When you enter into that phase of responsibility, you merit the ultimate level of divine intervention, assistance, that you come upon horizons that you wouldn't have only because you assume that level of responsibility. I'll give you an example. Lahavdin. Person works for Rothschild Bank, and he hosts certain clients. He has to entertain certain clients. Another person is a salesman for a clothing company. Each of them are given a credit card to go cover their expenses within the context of their responsibilities. The peddler or the salesman, his credit card is an ordinary credit card with a limit, $5,000 limit. The one who hosts clients for Rothschild Bank, and he has to have that special car and that special wardrobe of clothing, stay in special hotels, and eat special restaurants. He has the black credit card because he has unlimited spending, because he has to host a different kind of client, because his responsibility is another level. Anything less than unlimited ability, it's not going to serve him to host his clients. The teacher who assumes responsibility to guarantee the eternity and perpetuation of Torah forever, what level is he assuming? He needs another level of understanding, of clarity and insights, because what's at stake? What's at stake is the whole future. Because being in the position of a teacher, I am transmitting to the future generation the word of God, and has to be transmitted in most succinct, clear, insightful way, and inspirational way. They should be inspired. Therefore, the teacher, when it comes to Torah, assumes another level of divine inspiration and intervention and clarity and understanding, because he assumed that responsibility, which is the most important, because that is the guarantor. He is the guarantor of the eternity of existence, of the Torah itself. That's why it's Talmidi Yosem Mikulam. Therefore, the great rabbi of the Talmud says, I've learned enormous as a student from teachers, as a colleague from a colleague, even more so. But for my students, surpass them to all, because it's another level of value and accomplishment. Therefore, you merit the ultimate level of divine intervention and assistance, what we call siyata d'shmaya. Okay? So first you have to study that Torah as a person. And what comes next? V'shinantom livonecho. You must teach it to your children. And the Talmud says, when the Torah uses these words, even though bonecha means to your children, it doesn't mean your children. It means you should teach your students. V'shinantom livonecho, you should teach your students. And the Talmud says, and the Rambam says this in the laws of Talmud Torah, the studies of Torah, Hua bonecho elu talmidecho. When the Torah says your children, your sons, these are your students. And cites a verse that students of the Torah are also considered the children of the teacher. Shinantim levonecho. It should say, even if that's the case, what his meaning was shinantom. It said v'libartem levonecho. You should teach it to your children. What is the meaning of the word shinantom? So the Gemara explains they should be shenunim bificha, that your level of acumen and accuracy and instantaneous recall should be immediate. That anybody should ask you any question in the Torah, you should be able to respond without any hesitation. That's the level of clarity and retention you have. And when you teach it to children with that kind of breadth and depth, and not this, I have to get back to you on it. There's no getting back. Any question you ask, the teacher should be in a position to respond. And sometimes it goes beyond preparation. There's certain things you can't prepare for. Either you're there or you're not there. An elementary school teacher, he could prepare, because he can entertain and prepare well enough. There's no question he can't answer the third grader, the fifth grader. But when you go into a more advanced level of teaching, the Talmud, and you lecture on the Gemara, and you elucidate it, and you reconcile many issues, then already, as much as you prepare, but to be able to respond at every level, you have to really be there. And if you're not there, you can't respond. It's interesting. Even if you're very well-versed and knowledgeable, you may have not thought of that question. But because of your knowledge base and your grasp of the subject matter, you can answer on the spot the question, because that's how well-versed you are in the subject matter. Not that you read it anywhere, but it's the accumulation and the integration of all your knowledge. That's why you're able to respond. You, shinunum beficha, the word shinun means sharp. It should be sharp in your mouth. Respond with a sharpness, with an immediacy, with a clarity. That's the way the Torah has to be given over to students. Just share something personal with you. Shiva, Zecher Tzadik Lebrocha, blessed memory. He was one of the leading Torah sages in the world. when I'd studied under him. As a student in Slobodka, which was one of the most advanced yeshivas in Europe, in Lithuania, he was one of the premier students of that yeshiva. He entered in yeshiva when he was 13. He finished the Talmud in its entirety by the age of 14. He was a genius, and he had phenomenal memory. When he was 18, he published his first work on the Talmud. And he has all kinds of approbations from the leading Torah sages of that generation on the work that he had written. Now, and I was he mentored me. From the age of 16 till the age of 34, I spoke to him every day of the week. I was engaged with him continuously. He had the Talmud on his fingertips. There's nothing you couldn't discuss with him at every level. Besides consulting with him on issues which did not relate directly to the Talmud. That was the breadth of person. When you would engage with him, you understood, in my own mind, I could never be at his level. It was beyond. It's like from another era. Other teachers I had, when I studied under them, also they were very advanced. As a 16, 17-year-old student, I thought in my mind, someday I can know as much as they, and even more than they know. But my Rosh Hashiva, he's beyond. So what did I get from our Rosh Hashiva? Besides hearing his lectures, what I received from him was an inspiration. He inspired me. He had such a breadth of knowledge. He was so magnanimous in terms of sharing his knowledge with me. I'm a 16, 17-year-old kid. He's a man, he's 65, 67 years old when he first took me under his wing. And he spends time listening to what I have to say, and he shares things with me, and I see what he knows. It's like almost unlimited amount of knowledge. He see what's available, and the way he communicated with a genius, with a spirit. He would electrify the audience, the students, when he would say a public lecture. That's what he would do. It's like he would drop like a bombshell, and the whole place would go wild because of an insight he said, and discuss it back and forth. So I understood I could never be like him. Nobody believed they could be like him. But in what way did he touch him? He touched you because he shows you the innate value of what it is and how special it is. And therefore, it created a motivation and inspiration and interest to want to be an achiever, to succeed in that, to your best, to do your best. And you never know what your best really is. Sometimes only after a lifetime, after you've invested yourself, do you know, and it doesn't mean to see what kind of position you get, knowledge-wise. How well do you understand it? What is the extent of your knowledge? What is that? That's Vishinantum Levanecho. If you're at that special level, there's nothing you can't respond to. And when you respond, you respond with a sharpness, with an intellect, with a genius. And when your students hear it, they're not learning something which is, I've heard it before. What difference does it make? What's its value? When you touch on that level, those questions don't even enter into the student's mind. You're just amazed by the innateness and the innate value of the Torah. And because it's the real thing, you're touched. It's really the spiritual energy which touches our souls, and you get activated. That's the Shinantum Levanecho. The Talmud tells us, the Torah in the book of Bamidbar, where it says these are the children of Moshe and Aaron. Moshe and Aaron. And it only mentions Aaron's children. Doesn't mention Moshe's children. So what's the takeaway? It says these are the children of Moshe and Aaron, and it only mentions Aaron's children. It doesn't mention Moshe's children. So the Midrash asks, they're Aaron's children, not Moshe's children. So the Midrash answers, and it's a Gemara, answers, when you teach Torah to the child of a fellow, and it's as if you gave birth to him. Meaning, a Jew, what is the ingredients? You know, a person's a sculptor. He has his little hammer and he has a chisel, and he goes and he sculpts this piece of stone into whatever it is, a masterpiece. He has his tools, the tools of his trade. What molds a Jew? His perspective, his soul, his feelings, his emotion. What molds it? Being touched by Torah in a special way. So the teacher who teaches the son of somebody else, although biologically the other person is his father, and halachically it's his father, but in a certain context, the teacher who mentors that student, God says, you're the equivalent of his father. The Mishnah tells us that if you have a lost article of a Rebbe and lost article of a parent, you have an obligation to return it to either of them. But which one takes priority? The father or the teacher? So it says, the Mishnah concludes, the lost article of the teacher. Why? Because the father brought you into physical life. The teacher, he brings you l'chayil mabo. He gives you relevance to eternity, the world to come. Therefore, his contribution in your life is greater than your father's. Therefore, returning the lost article to him takes priority over the lost article to a parent. So what are we talking about? How does he bring to the world to come? Because by teaching him the Torah at the special level, giving him the knowledge, giving him the sense of its value, now his perspective, his mind, his emotion is geared in what direction? It's within a spiritual context. Therefore, the decisions he makes now are due to whose input? That special teacher's input. As a result of that, why does that person have a share in the world to come? Because the person who mentored him. As a result of that, the teacher's lost article takes priority over the father's, because the father brought him to a physical existence, physical life. The teacher brought him to the world to come, because everything about the student now is geared and oriented towards spirituality due to the teacher's input and teachings. Now you understand and appreciate why the Rebbe merits a level of siyata d'shmaya, of divine assistance, to succeed and understand it, and to be worthy and meritorious, rather than the student studying from the teacher or a colleague interacting within a Torah context with a colleague. Because the ultimate is what is mentoring that student, preparing and creating the future generation, which will guarantee the perpetuation of Torah till the end of time.